Hey everybody, my name's Darrell Bear. Welcome back to Journey to VR. This week I'm going to continue doing look development of my project inside of Unreal. So basically picking up where we left off last week. So we're going to be adding in some reflections or faked reflections, some indirect illumination, as well as some really cool post effects. So this is where we were last week, and basically what I have here is a scene. I've added a couple more lights into it, but essentially what we've got going on is our environment that's got our emissive textures being properly shadowed, which was what we went over last week. And what we want to do is we want to start to add in some more refinement to this. So the first thing I want to do is add in a little bit of bumping onto the wall. So I'm going to add a normal map onto the walls. And to do that, I'm actually going to be using Crazy Map, which is just a utility that you can download. It's free. It's actually shareware, so you can make a donation. And essentially what it does is it allows you to de-light textures, do some basic de-lighting, as well as do some normal map extraction from the texture. And so it's kind of a faked normal map, but it actually does add a little bit of kind of roughness to the walls, which I think make it look a bit better. So if you click on the normal section, the first thing you're going to want to do for this is basically get rid of the very large details and get rid of the medium details. Actually, we'll kind of crank all that stuff down and turn down the shape recognition to something to like 0. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to add in some of these fine details as well as some of the very, very fine details and a little bit of the fine details. So just kind of get, kind of derive a little bit of bump from that guy. And you can see how it's kind of picking up the textures as well as where those pipes were. The pipes are actually not as important because those are actually extra pieces of geometry, but I'm just trying to get a little bit of tiny kind of bumping happening there on the walls and things like that. So that's what I did. And as I mentioned before, it also has the ability to do some things like de-lighting of texture. So if you wanted to, you could remove some of the shading of this guy and remove some of the highlights and then use that as one of your maps if you wanted to mix it in. Now, I'm not going to be using that in my project, but it does have the ability to do some kind of de-shading stuff, which is kind of cool, kind of slick. So with that done, we'll jump back over into Unreal and we're going to add in that normal map onto our file. So if we just kind of come over here, actually we'll go into maps and we'll just do an import first. So we'll import this guy in and it saves it out with an NRM underscore NRM at the end there. Bring that guy in. And the thing that's kind of nice is Unreal actually recognizes this as a normal map when it comes in. So if you double click on the texture once it's done importing and look at it, you can see that it's come in and it's put it into the texture group for world normal. And it's also turned off sRGB. So it kind of figures out that it's a normal map automatically, which I think is great. And I'm not sure if it's doing that. It must be doing that because it had that NRM in the name and it must have some token stuff derived. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning that we're going to fix in just a second is notice that it imported it in as an 8K file, but it's currently displaying it in my editor as a 4K file and the max in-game resolution is at a 4K file. So we're going to want to change that so that we get the full resolution. And I'll show you how to do that right after we hook it up. So with all that said, if we jump back into the material that's on the walls here and we bring in that map, if we just drag and drop it in here, you can see that it comes in and there it is. And you can see that it doesn't have that, here we can blow that guy away. You can see that it doesn't have the sRGB profile assigned to it. So that's exactly what you want. And you just pipe this out into normal. And then if we just click the apply button, it's going to go through and it's going to give those walls just a little bit of specularity break or pop on that. Now, like I said before, these maps are 8K maps. That photogrammetry process did make 8K maps for us, but we're currently not seeing 8K maps in our scene. So if you kind of look at this, it's a little soft, especially on the, it's just not quite as crisp as it should be. So how do you get the 8K maps? Well, you actually have to modify a configuration file. So if you jump over to the projects, so in here it's just basically in your documents, Unreal Projects, VR Look Dev, saved, config Windows. So that's the path to the file. And the file that you want to change is device profiles INI. So if you just take that, and there's a big line of code here that basically is going through and setting up the max texture size to pump it up to be above the 4K clamp that's being applied right now. So if we just do a file save on this, which is great. We'll jump back into Unreal, and you have to actually quit the program and then restart it. So I'm going to save all my changes that we've done here, and we'll exit the editor and then restart it back up. So I'll be back in 2 seconds after I do that. All right, so here we are back inside of Unreal, and if we double click on one of these texture maps, you can see that it's now using the full 8K for both the display in the editor as well as the in-game resolution. So things like our texture maps now are going to get their full quality and they're going to look a little bit crisper and a little bit sharper, which is exactly what we want for our VR experience. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is indirect illumination. There's a couple ways of doing it inside of Unreal. I'm going to be using a skylight to do it. This is going to work really well with the forward renderer. So what you have to do it is just jump over to lights, and inside of lights, if you grab out a skylight and drop that guy in your scene, this is kind of set up to make a lighting model that's big outdoor light scenes, right? Like things like the sky, basically, like it's called a skylight. We're going to be using it to do an indoor model. So to help it, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a texture map that's already derived, that lighting probe that John made for this kind of main room that all of our action is going to be happening in. So how do you do that? Well, it's really straightforward. You just need to go over here, make sure the light source is selected, and then switch your type over to cube map, and then drag and drop in that high dynamic range lat long file. It goes through and actually makes a cube map for it out of itself. Now you add that in there, and you'll notice that this didn't get brighter. That area that's getting in shadow didn't get any brighter. And the reason it didn't get any brighter is because by default, this light source, this sky, has cast shadows turned on, and obviously we're inside of a volume, so it's essentially shadowing itself. So if you turn cast shadows off, you can see immediately that we start to get a little bit of kind of secondary bounce happening or global illumination happening on that back of that object. It's getting lit by that skylight, or we're faking the effect of global illumination actually in this example. So what we're going to do is just look at this model really quickly, because what's happening is it also has the lower hemisphere set to be black, which isn't what we want. So we're going to turn that lower hemisphere off to make sure that we're getting the light of the actual ground also hitting into that guy. So those couple of things makes it look a good bit better, a whole lot better actually. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to start playing around with doing some reflections. And obviously you can adjust the intensity of this, right? Like if I turn this down to 0, there's no contribution from that light source. And if I crank it over below it, it's not going to look realistic. So we'll just leave it sort of around a value of 1. It looks pretty good around that. It feels about right. My ball is a little bit off white. It's about 0.6 in value. So that looks about right to me. So the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and talk about reflections. So reflections are really easy to set up, or faked reflections, I should say, are really easy to set up inside of Unreal. Because we're using the forward renderer, we can't use screen-based reflections, but we can still use reflection probes on objects that we might want to have a metallic look or a plastic with some reflections and things like that. So let me walk you through that very quickly. So just go ahead and drag and drop in a sphere. And what that's going to do is this is going to generate a reflection automatically from that area that it's sort of that sphere exists in. And if we double click on our material, and we'll just switch this guy over to be metallic just so you can get a sense of what it's doing. So holding down my 1 key and clicking allows me to make a float. If we drag and drop this guy, pipe this guy into metallic and set its value to something like 1 to make it, it's either on or off. It's a Boolean. It's either a metallic object or it's not. So we'll put it to 1, and we'll put this down to 0.1, not 0.1, 0.1. So it's very, very smooth surface that is acting like a metal. So as soon as we do that, you can see it's going to go through and compile this guy, and we have something that, wow, it looks like a metal, which is exactly what you'd want. So that's cool. It's picked up this light probe in that scene. You can kind of position this guy, in an area where it's going to be near the objects that you want to work. Now, this is great for things that are in my main stage, for the reflections. But what happens if my sphere or my objects that I want to see are, maybe back down here? Well, you wouldn't expect it to have that same reflection, right? It would have a reflection, sort of those stairs and things like that. So this is really one of the things that Unreal does that I think is really cool. It can have multiple reflections. So if we drag and drop a spherical reflection out in this area, you can see that it's now, positioning that guy, and it looks like it's reflecting the correct object. The objects are reflecting the correct environment when they're back there. And then obviously if I just grab this sphere and then bring it up here, it's going to be using this map, and it will transition between these probes. And you can have as many of these probes. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a number that it starts to get overwhelming, but you can have a few of these guys around your scene, and they just do a great job of making reflections look like they should in that given region or that area, which I think is really pretty awesome. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is setting up some post effects. So let's go ahead and get our object back to kind of a shinier looking plasticky type thing. So we'll just switch this metallic switch over to something like, I don't know, 0, because it's either on or off. And we'll hit apply on that guy and close this down. So it's now going to be it's still gonna have a little bit of reflection on there because it's got that low roughness. It's got that indirect model that's kind of hopping in there from that skylight, which looks, really cool. I might make the indirect a little bit stronger. Let's just do like 1.2 or something like that. Just give it a little more fill on that bottom edge there. But that looks pretty cool. So post effects, they're also under visual effects, same place that we got those reflection probes. And the post effects node that comes in here this is probably one of the coolest things in Unreal as far as rendering goes, in my opinion. It just does so many things. It's super, super fun to play with. So you kind of scale the volume up, and then anytime you're inside of that volume, those post effects are going to get applied to your look, to your render. So let's go ahead and jump inside that guy, and we'll start playing around with some parameters on this post effects volume. So post effects process volume. And really where all these happen is inside the post process volume tab, there's a settings tab. And this is where the magic happens. So you expand that settings out, and then you just have a ton of things that you can do. So, obviously really straightforward stuff like basic temperature. All right, let's just change the color temperature of my scene to make it cooler or warmer. Very, very simple thing to do. Obviously, there's a bunch of grading in here. And there are a lot of these attributes will say X, Y, Z. They're just vectors. So X, Y, Z is the same thing as RGB for color stuff. So if you wanted to, play around with the gamma on this guy, instead of X, Y, Z and interviewing each one individually, you can just go to the W and use that to, let's turn on the switch. Use the W is basically like a multiplier of all of those guys. So if you wanted to make it really crunchy and really poppy, you could drop that gamma down a little bit. That looks kind of cool, gives it a little bit of different look. And then you can come in here and start playing around with all these different tabs. And there's some really fun ones. Like if you go into scene color, one of the ones that you can play around with is vignetting. Love to put a little bit of vignetting on there. So if you increase that, it's going to get a little bit edgier, kind of darkens on the edges there, gives you some film vignetting. And then fringe. Fringe is really cool. This is like a digital camera artifact, so it sort of gives you that in high contrast area, like right here, that kind of purple fringe that happens. Photographers spend their lives trying to get gear that doesn't do that, and then I guess digital artists spend their lives trying to get effects that add it back in. But I'll just add a little bit of fringe in there. We'll go something like, 0.5 on that guy. And then grain. Everyone loves grain. Let's give it a little bit of grain intensity inside of that guy just to kind of give it this kind of cool, fun look. That looks really pretty sweet. I love that. And then where you can really start to do some fun stuff is when you start to play around with some of the blooming and glows. So if we go in here to bloom, it's already got a little bit of bloom on there. Like you can see that point light's burning out over top of the sphere right here a little bit, but you can overdrive that, by adding in a higher value of 1. And then you can also adjust, all the different parameters. So threshold, and there's multiple blooms. You can see that there's different sizes, 4, 1, 4, 7. They kind of go around and kind of give layered stacking blooms on top of each other, and you can overdrive all that stuff. So I'm just going to drop that threshold down a little bit so that only the really hot areas will kick that bloom off, and you get a sense of how when that guy moves in and out of that bloom, how it kind of fades on and fades off. And obviously this light's now blooming out a bit more because we've really kind of jacked that up or cranked that value up. But that's just super, super cool. And then the final thing that I'm going to play around with is just lens flare. So go in here and add in the intensity of this little lens flares happening, and the flares will kick off of specular highlights as well as the lights. And obviously, that might be a little strong, so you can just kind of drop that lens flare down ever so slightly. But that starts to give you this, I don't know. I think that's just so much fun and super, super cool. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys and you are enjoying the journey to VR. If you're watching this on Vimeo or YouTube, make sure you go back to the area. On the area, there's a Journey to VR blog section, and I've been doing lots of recorded tutorials as well as interviews with some of our customers. And obviously, we've been doing some written articles also that kind of share a lot of the industry experts' opinions on VR and things that they've been doing. So make sure you take the time to go back to Journey to VR. Thanks again for watching it. Cheers, everybody.